Welcome to the Workshop Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, and joining me today is University of Richmond professor, multiple published. Are you a best-selling author, or we just say it's best-selling?
We'll
That
just
way,
say
every
selling.
selling author, and by the end of this podcast, I expect it to be best-selling author, Dr. Kelly Lambert. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Yeah. Why don't you give yourself a little bit of an introduction here for the listeners? We talked a little bit in the pre-show.
Mhm.
Plug for the pre-show to go, support that so you actually get more of a conversation. But if you don't mind introducing yourself to the audience, I'd appreciate it.
All right. I'm a professor of behavioral neuroscience at the University of Richmond, as you said, in Virginia. I've been doing this for almost 4 decades, working at mostly primarily undergraduate institutions. So Randolph-Macon College for about 27 years before. I've been at University of Richmond about 10 years. My focuses on what I call experience-based neuroplasticity. That's just how the brain changes throughout our lives. We're focusing more on the positive changes, but it can change, and depending on what our experiences are. So I teach a good bit in the field of behavioral neuroscience and animal behavior. As we were talking about before, I enjoy writing for mainstream audiences and for students. I'm a first-generation college student, so I enjoy trying to interpret this so everyone can maybe benefit from neuroscience. So my books include Lifting Depression, The Lab Rat Chronicles, everything I've learned from rodents, which has been a lot. The most recent one, but several years old now, is Well Grounded, The Neurobiology of Rational Decisions. And then coming out in October will be Wild Brains, what we can learn by looking at not just the rats that I've looked at so often and what biomedical research looks at, but across the animal spectrum. So we're looking at different species and also looking at the animals not in laboratory environments exclusively, but also trying to get out there where they are in the wild. So we're trapping wild rats and going to Madagascar and looking at mouse lemurs and trying. My favorite is the raccoon because they're so smart and they use their hands and paws like our hands. And this is one of our best tools and activates so much of the brain. So I also coined this term behaviorceuticals, which is the idea that we can use behavior intentionally to change our brain physiology and neurochemistry in positive ways. So trying to make it sound a little bit kind of like medicine. There's pharmaceuticals, but that hasn't really brought any cures for psychiatric illness that I have heard of yet. Some people benefit from certain drugs, but it's also worthwhile seeing how behavior and experiences can change the brain as well. So I think that's me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great introduction. I was actually going to ask you about the whole behaviorceutical. I'd never heard the term before until I'd watched your TED Talk, and I was like, that's a genius way of phrasing that, because you're right. Like, so we talked a little bit about my educational background in the pre-show there, and the audience has heard me say things like this ad nauseum, but you don't know this. I actually, one of my master's degrees, I'm a grad school dropout as well as a grad school completionist. One of my master's degrees was functional medicine and human nutrition.
Love
And
it.
so, yeah, I spent 2 years of the three, and then kind of life got in the way and business got in the way, and I put it on hold and then withdrew from the program. But enough of an exposure that fairly well balanced knowledge of how the physiology of pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals and that type of stuff. And it's shocking how much, especially when you're talking about psychiatric conditions, how much pharmaceuticals are like, oh, wow, this is the new wonder drug for this thing, but it's
Mhm.
only slightly better than placebo.
Right. You're exactly right, Andrew. And a lot more side effects, and it's expensive and hard to get off of many of them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and some of them are shockingly, well, the placebo is effective 50 or 60 or 70%
Mhm.
of the time, and this one's 72%, so therefore it's better.
Or even shorter. If it's statistically significant, which may be 3 percentage points or something, you
Yeah,
can sell it. But then there's kind of real life practical significance. We need both. We need, yeah. So when there's money and with pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of money and it's a, yeah, I mean, there may be some cure. So I'm not anti-pharmaceutical. I'm just frustrated. When I was writing my first textbook, Clinical Neuroscience, I was writing the chapter on depression. And I just thought, this is, we have the drugs, but they're not really based on theoretic. They're kind of serendipitous discoveries about this is being given for this. And by the way, it helps with this. What does it do? Let's go back and look. So they weren't really theoretically grounded. And they're, as you said, they're not really statistically significant from the placebo in many cases. So I tried to be a good kind of student of the literature, wrote the chapter, and then that's what prompted me to go back and write the book, Lifting Depression. And that's when I started to think about and just see how impactful behavior and experience and lifestyle. And that's not new to me, but it's just never been elevated. It's not treated. Our Western notion of medicine is a pill or surgery. It's not something related to lifestyle, but your brain changes in so many ways with sensory experiences and cognitive challenge. And it's just so much more engaged with those experiences, but there's not a lot of money to be made off of it. So yeah, behaviorseuticals was my attempt to try to make it sound important.
Well, I always, so when I was a chiropractor and treating people with chronic pain and physical pain and stuff, I always told people that the closest thing that we have to a magic bullet for any condition is just diet and exercise. And I still tell people that now the closest thing we have to a magic bullet for depression is diet and exercise. It's like,
Right. And yeah, I don't mean to, exercise is incredibly interesting as well. The behaviorseuticals, it includes that, but also, so with exercise, you're getting increased glucose and oxygen to the brain. It's so important. So it's fueling the brain. And also with exercise, or you put rats in a running wheel, you get more, we talk about neuroplasticity, you get more of these new neurons in an area involved in the hippocampus. But even beyond that, and that's incredibly important, of course, diet, nutrients that change into neurotransmitters, they're precursors and so important. But this notion with behaviorseuticals also includes things like hobbies, intentionally planning something. I use the example of knitting, even though I don't knit. But when you're planning, you're doing repetitive behaviors, you're creating something that hopefully you like. So you've got dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin, which is kind of this cuddle, I'm oversimplifying, a chemical if you're doing this with other people. So that's a really powerful cocktail, neurotransmitter cocktail and hormone cocktail. And all of that, if it reduces stress is it's a sidekick for almost every psychiatric illness and a lot of other illnesses too. So if we can get stress in check and enhance some of these other neurochemicals through an activity, that's great. So diet, exercise, yes, but then there's these other types of behavior that would put all under this umbrella.
yeah, it all kind of comes together, and that's kind of where I've been going with this podcast here recently is when I sent you the introduction email inviting you on, I talked about how kind of focusing on the application of hands-on craft and stuff in a therapeutic setting, right? And I'll take a step back from that and kind of give you my thought process from where I arrived at this idea for myself, and then you can criticize me and tell me I'm all wrong. But I kind of started approaching it from more of like an existential thing, right? And I was curious about the mental health crisis that's happening, just like you're aware of how, despite the fact that we have all these new drugs and all this new stuff, everybody's increasingly depressed and anxious, and current world events and recent world events don't help with that, I'm sure. But I also think that maybe we've become so specialized in our activities, and we've lost so many skill sets that it's almost creating this existential crisis of fear of incompetence. My grandpa, for example, he had 11 kids and had a farm of 160 acres or something like that, just a small farm. Didn't have water, didn't have electricity, didn't have a phone, all that type of stuff, right? But he raised his family. And then fast forward these few years, I have a brother who's a farmer, and he has a several thousand acre farm. And we were having this conversation about how it was a struggle for him to sometimes feed his 2 kids. And so the world is pushing us towards these cubicles, whether it's a tractor cubicle or an office cubicle, is pushing us towards these specializations to where we don't have this generalized knowledge and generalized ability to do things. And so then I think we have this existential crisis of like, oh no, how am I going to take care of myself if the world ends? You know, I don't know. What do you think about that idea?
No, I think what you're touching on is, this sense of agency and control. I agree that, I know a good bit about neuroscience and rats, but if something happens, my computer breaks, it's not working, I've got to call IT. I have no ability to really repair that. And my husband and I were talking about that as well. He's from Georgia, grew up in what we call the country, and he was talking about how, and he's kind of rare. He has his PhD, but we recently moved and everything, he's building stuff, putting it together, doing yard work. He's kind of a jack of all trades with that. And a lot of our friends are like, and in fact, my new son-in-law said, Gary, you're making me look bad because my daughter keeps saying my dad could do that in 2 minutes and he's having to call someone to do it. But when you have the ability to repair or work with a lot of different things, it gives you a little bit more, the sense of control that, okay, if something goes wrong and this person isn't there, I'm not out of luck. So I think that even though, like with your grandfather, it was probably a very stressful and what we may call hard life, he probably had a greater sense of control, even though I know with farming and weather and all of that is tough. My husband was also talking about because we're just having this conversation this weekend about his grandparents or grandfathers. They never, if something broke on the farm, they never called someone. They figured out how to repair it. And that, if you think back, I think I saw a TED talk, it was interesting, or some talk about back in the day, they had these like J.C. Penney and the Sears and J.C. Penney were these two department stores, and they had a lot, when you bought something, it had all these instructions because you were going to repair it or you'd order a kit. So you were responsible for understanding, how things worked in your home. And so some people still are really great at that. And I love that do-it-yourself, DIY kinds of activities and home improvement. That's kind of been on the rise. And I think that's great. You have this sense of pride, accomplishment. But you're right. If you're trained to do one little thing, and then you don't have control over other things in your life, and then today, when a lot of people are fearful that AI is going to take over your one little thing, and you may not have another little thing that you're trained to do, that brings on a lot of stress about how to take care of yourself. So I think there is a multifaceted situation of why maybe something like depression is on the rise, but certainly that's part of it. I think you're onto something.
So your husband sounds like a man after my own heart. I always tell people that I'm probably one of the very few people you'll ever meet who can call himself a doctor, but also has a Class 1 or a commercial driver's license.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
You have
it's one of
something to
those.
fall back on.
Yeah, well, hopefully I never do. But I ran across this idea just recently here that I never heard before, but I don't know if you've ever heard of the term purple collar? Purple.
I haven't. What is that?
So you got white collar workers, right? That's your
Blue
traditional
collar.
high tech, all that type of stuff. And then you have blue collar workers, and those are your typical construction. Purple collar workers are the people who have a white collar job but do blue collar stuff at home.
Well, that's my husband.
And that's like, I ran across that just a couple of weeks ago now, I guess. And it's like, that is an excellent term because it does encompass those people who are, like this type of job. I sit and I talk to people all day long, but I'm also building my house. I'm also a woodworker and I built furniture and
I think that's great.
live on a farm and all of these types of things. And this kind of, and I'm by no means saying that because of my lifestyle, I have perfect mental health and I've never had any issues whatsoever, because that would be
Well, no
mostly
one is in that.
untrue.
No one can say that, I don't think.
But this kind of this kind of brings this to the full circle into why I wanted to talk to you. So
Uh-huh.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I had a difficult time finding any information that didn't ultimately funnel back to you about the effort-driven rewards cycle. Are
Mm.
you kind of like the original brainchild of that, or did I miss something in my looking?
I introduced the term, and I
And so
don't
could
think it's
you?
been picked up by others. There's some like activity based, there's some terms that are related to it, but I think probably our lab is one of the only using the effort based reward kind of idea.
So could you kind of explain that for people? I brought it up a couple times on the podcast here, just kind of in passing as I've been talking with people. But would you mind
Sure.
explaining what that is then?
Yeah. And my curiosity just led me to this. As I was saying when I was writing the textbook and got frustrated about why do we not have something that works better for depression and other psychiatric illnesses. And Tom Insel, who was a former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, he made the point, and I think it was very honest of him about being frustrated about not being able to be more impactful. Because when you look at other diseases, cardiovascular disease and AIDS and diabetes and a lot of cancers, our survival rates have gotten a lot better as medicine and our knowledge about, biomedical kinds of issues has enhanced. And we have a lot of great scientists studying the brain and neuroscience, a lot of findings, but it just hasn't translated. So there's this frustration. So I was frustrated writing this chapter in the book. And when I started to write Lifting Depression, I kind of wanted to start with a blank slate. Okay, what do we know about the brain? What don't we know about the brain? What is depression? We throw a diagnosis onto something. It doesn't mean that it's in our genes, depression, schizophrenia, but there's this cluster of symptoms that we started to call these certain conditions. But so looking at the brain, kind of being a brain whisperer, so to speak, I started to look at some of the characteristic or signature symptoms of depression are related to one of my favorite neuroscientists, Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers and some other things. A lot of other, like Determined was his latest. He describes depression as an inability to appreciate a sunset. Things that used to be rewarding, they're just not. Hanging out with friends or your favorite food. So there's that mood value, valence kind of idea. And then there's other things, lack of energy and such. And then the sadness as well. So I started to look at the brain real estate, and a lot of there are two things that were important. A lot of the brain real estate is devoted to movement. And as a student of the brain, we talk more about cognition, our ability to think and emotions, but not a lot about movement. But the cerebellum that hangs off the back of our brain amazingly has in humans 78% of all of our 86 billion neurons are in the cerebellum, and it's known mostly for motor coordination, and it's involved in conscious awareness and some other things. So that's movement. And then the big center part of the brain where the striatum is, which is affected when someone has Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, big chunk, that's movement. And then this motor strip that allows me to voluntarily move my hand and arm, wave that around. That's a lot of the brain devoted to movement. And interestingly, an area that is most known for reward and kind of approaching something is this area called the nucleus accumbens. And it's in this kind of reward area of the brain. And it has connections to that striatum. In fact, it's called the ventral striatum. So suggesting that, and it has some different components. One is more emotion, but one related to the movement. So it suggested that movement could play an integral role in reward. And if we think about our ancestors, I mean, if you were not a couch potato, but a cave potato, and you didn't get out there, foraged, hunted, whatever, however you're getting resources and building relationships, you're not going to survive. But what gets us up? We've got to move around most of the time we're sitting in a digital world, so I can do a lot just sitting in this chair for good and bad to get my resources. But there weren't any different, you couldn't press a button to get Uber Eats or whatever back then, or get takeout. So we had to be moving to get our resources. So it's incredibly important. When we did something that was probably good for us, we found food, we had a relationship, we achieved something. Our brain said, yay, and it remembered it, and we were motivated to do that again. So that's not just reward falling from the sky, as you mentioned, I think we did the trust fund rights. This is work, this is reward that is dependent on our interaction with the world and our role in getting that. So it seems to be more impactful doing. And some people, it's fun kind of talking about this, and people will say, "Oh, I really love cooking a dinner that people enjoy. Maybe I get more reward out of that." But there's no one size fits all. It's what works for you. You mentioned woodworking or building. So we don't want to force everybody to knit or everybody to do woodworking, but find what you get, what you kind of lose yourself in, but then it is very rewarding. And also it kind of, when I say lose yourself, it distracts you sometimes from worrying about that next payment coming up or relationship with your boss or something. There's so many beneficial and kind of therapeutic aspects of it. So effort-based rewards are rewards that are dependent on our effort and our interaction with the environment and our sense of control over that.
I just thinking about effort in the creation of things. I was reading I forget if it was a news article. Sorry, my sound just suddenly went funny here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay, it's not hissing or anything on your end?
No.
Okay, I'm going to mark that for editing out. But
Okay.
anyway, I was reading this thing from IKEA. It was about IKEA and the way they engineer their products. And IKEA, is notorious for their irritating little
Lots of
instructions
parts.
and lots of parts. But this article was talking about how IKEA can actually engineer something to be super simple to put together with no effort whatsoever. But they deliberately do that. They deliberately engineer it that way because it gives people a sense of pride in their creative process.
I
If
love that, Andrew.
if it
I
was
need to
too
look that
easy,
up.
then it wouldn't have the same value to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a story that was related to that, but I couldn't actually confirm it, so I had to take it out. But the idea was the same. Going back, there's this kind of mix for making cakes and stuff called Betty Crocker. And the idea was, at first they had just a mix, you just added water. And then they realized that I guess it's mostly women, but the people making it, they didn't have a sense of ownership over it. So they backed up and required adding an egg. And just if you added an egg, it made you feel like you were contributing more, and it increased the sales. So I'm not, I can't, I don't know if that's absolutely true, but that idea. So I think there's some research showing that people who construct their own IKEA products versus having someone do it have a greater sense of reward or whatever, but I hadn't seen that they were being strategic. Maybe they're one of the two people that's read my research.
Yeah, it's probably apocryphal, like the Betty Crocker thing, maybe, but
Yeah.
it's an interesting idea to think about, and then so one of my more recent guests on here, Nev Jones, I think he's a couple episodes ago. He's a psychologist in Australia, and he has his waiting room is a workbench with hand
bet.
planes and chisels and stuff like that. And so people come in there, and he says it's amazing to watch people. They'll come in super stressed, and they'll go grab the hand plane and take a couple pieces of shaving off of the wood, and then they'll calm right down.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's actually what kind of sent me down the rabbit hole after talking to him, because I've talked to hundreds of people at this point about individuals and guests and clients and specifically about their hobby and their mental health, and it's phenomenal how many people, like, my shop is my therapy, or
Yeah.
my painting is my therapy, or my thing is my therapy.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, it doesn't have to be woodworking. It doesn't have to be a hand plane pushing through wood, although I think that that's probably the best option. But you're right, is whatever gives you joy. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. And so you've done most of your work with rats and animals and stuff like that. Have you seen any clinical application of your
I've seen a couple of anecdotal, for example, where individuals who had something like PTSD or something read Lifting Depression, but there hasn't been a lot like clinical trials. But I'll give you one example. It's Patrick Wells. He's in the UK, and he was a war journalist, and so he was kind of in the zone, and so it's very, very stressful. He's seen a lot, and he was recognizing his symptoms as he wasn't officially diagnosed, but as PTSD. But he didn't really want to start meds. And so he had read Lifting Depression or something related to it. And he decided, although he'd never done it, that he was going to build a boat with his own two hands. And he started, he ordered the lumber and he started to do it. And he wrote an article in the London Times, and he called me and interviewed me, and it was just very, very rewarding for me to hear this story of how impactful and therapeutic. He said just planning and looking forward to doing it every day. And in fact, it was so therapeutic for him that he stopped being a war correspondent and he started this business called My Own Two Hands. And he uses his journalistic skills to create videos. So they do things like basket weaving, and he has a video about how to do it, or carving a spoon and a video about how to do it. And they sell that. And so I'm not a clinician, but I've just started getting it off the ground, an institute called the Braintree, Brain Translational Research, Education, and Experience, where in my golden part of my career here, I want to be more mindful about translating what I've learned, had the privilege of learning with what we call preclinical and rodent research to human populations, and trying to understand more and apply it where there are vulnerable populations. Enriched environments, engaging environments are so important. But one of my passions is, people who are incarcerated, especially in solitary confinement. We don't use any of our knowledge about how to rehabilitate a brain or keep a brain semi-sane in those situations. And that could get kind of, I don't want it to be political, just science-based about, are we using what we know for all aspects of our human population? And in some ways, I'm kind of getting off topic, but there are more regulations for me to take care of rats than there are of some humans in some situations. And that
Yeah, in situations like that, scientifically, it's actually it's not rehabilitating; it's further damaging. And
absolutely.
and the science, not apolitical.
Right. So I'm trying to be an annoying voice in that, but it's a good kind of challenge, starting to work with departments of correction and just to learn myself about the history of incarceration in different countries and data. So my long-winded answer is there hasn't been a lot. There have been some studies that have shown like college students who knit are less likely to be depressed than others. I think there's just something in the Wall Street Journal, I haven't even pulled it, came on my feed about how there are craft little gathering places now that are helping people deal with their stress. So I'm seeing a little bit more attention, or maybe people looking at this as a possibility. But we've got to understand the science behind it so it doesn't just look like a light, fluffy, nothing burger, that we really understand how this can help our brains. And I think that will elevate the prestige of something like this.
I think you're spot on that, and I think somebody like yourself needs to be the voice of that too, because again, not to say anything too political, but currently certain administrations are cutting funding for research. That what good does it do to spend money researching whether or not you can teach a rat how to drive a motorcycle or a
I'm a big
little,
target.
right? And like what value is that to anybody that we can have rats driving cars? Yay. But talking about what you've learned from that can then educate the public who may not necessarily be able to draw the connection between a driving self-driving rat car, and the fact that my buddy who just came home from war didn't commit suicide because he took up hand plane or
Yeah.
boat building or whatever.
Yeah, I will say that no government dollars have contributed to the rat driving project, but others. We have other ways of testing our effort-based rewards where the rats dig up Fruit Loop rewards. They love Fruit Loop cereal. But you're right, it takes, and that's why I enjoy writing for mainstream audiences. I appreciate you giving scientists a voice so that we can just talk, about why this may be important. But so many of my colleagues, and, it's been harder for me as well to get funding. Research takes a lot of money, it costs a lot. So we're going to go backwards. It'll take us a long time to make up what we've lost, but hopefully we can get back on track pretty soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, my most recent guest, speaking of PTSD, he has an organization called Plain Wellness, and he offers hand tool woodworking classes to people who have PTSD or disabilities for free. And then, as the business model is, anybody can take the class, but anybody has to pay for it. But if you have a disability or PTSD or mental, anything documented that way, then you can get the class for free. I think it's a great, to your point of, or to your organizations popping up around teaching people to do things. That's a great example of it, and one that I tell people to go support. And I'm sure that I would love, and maybe this is something I should actually dig into and see if I can find, but I would love to find an aggregating point of those, where people can say, hey, I have a course to teach somebody, and if you have depression or whatever, come here and we'll do that with you. I think that would be great. And I think your effort, it creates that resilience.
Hope
You know,
so.
creates it in a rat, and it really should create it in a person. I mean, theoretically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm very careful about what we call, translating from or generalizing from rats to humans. They do have most of the same parts and neurochemicals and such, but they're not little humans. So we do need to do this clinical work. And it's not like doing surgery on someone or giving them a drug that we don't know works. So this should be pretty simple stuff to
It
do.
should
So
be.
in order to
Well,
elevate it, we would need to get, maybe influence policy where insurance companies may give you a lower premium or something if you're doing this, or they're going to help buy crafty stuff. Some of the hobby shops, a long time ago, one of them contacted me about how can we get this paid for by insurance, your yarn or something like that. But I'm even laughing, and I've got the data to support it, but some type of other incentives that recognize we see that this really helps, and we're going to incentivize it in some.
well, it's funny that people are absurd, really, when you stop and think about it, because everybody knows an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is just common knowledge, given fact for everybody to say. And yet, well, an exercise class is really expensive. My hobby is really expensive, but I'll drop 30, 40, $50 a month on my cable subscription or
Yep.
my streaming subscriptions now.
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you brought up prevention. I'm so glad you did, because some of I think the progress that we've made, especially like with cardiovascular disease and the reduction in deaths, is because we're focusing more on prevention. We have assessments of what your cholesterol is looking like, and the whole idea is to treat it before you have the heart attack or stroke. Because once you have that, it's a whole different ball game. But so often in psychiatric illness, it's after that psychotic break, that schizophrenic episode, that bout of depression, that we begin to look at it. So we need some better markers, biomarkers and such, stress hormones. So I'm interested in that, so that we can track someone to see when they're becoming more vulnerable. But we need to have this idea of, if you're not doing this, you probably are becoming more vulnerable, because this is what we evolved to do, to be three-dimensional and multifaceted and engaged, and not just sitting somewhere pressing a button. That's so condescending for our brains. It's so dumbed down for our brains, which are quite impressive.
And I think to some extent that hopefully that's changing, like the don't do anything about it until too late attitude. And I think some of it has to do with conversations like this and
Mhm.
conversations that I have with people of saying like, I went through this terrible thing and it's okay to talk about it. I think unfortunately as a culture we toxic masculinity of the past is a thing
Mhm.
where I don't hurt. I can't admit to hurting. I can't admit
Mhm.
to failing. I can't admit to being sad because those are all wimp things. And that culturally has created a situation where it's difficult to do prevention in certain ways or admit that you are doing prevention. And
Right. So I think what you're describing is related to just approaching therapy and such. And I think that that has changed a good bit. I guess what I'm talking about is even before that, learning in middle school and high school that it's important for me to do this so that I will have, maintain this mental health. And I think on the topic of aging and age related decline, there's a more interest in prevention. We have this whole longevity push now. So that gets people's attention about. The supplements are still kind of more popular than the doing something, but people are at least trying to prevent that decline.
well, the supplements are easier.
Right. It's so much
Is-
easier to take a pill than to do
And
something, even exercise.
and it's so much more profitable too. Like not to
Mhm.
not to be a conspiracy theorist and big pharma or anything like
Mhm.
that, but the reality of it is and from a research perspective, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this one. Um, I think the gold standard for research, especially with health concerns, is the double-blind placebo-controlled trial,
Mhm.
and that doesn't work for anything except for a pill. You can't do that with a physical therapy
Right.
of some sort or an activity. You
Yeah, I mean
can't.
that's been, a big part of our research with the rats is exposing them to what we call enriched environments, kind of like Disneyland. They're still in the lab and they're still rats, so it's limited. But going back to the 60s, we knew that that made their brains, the outside, thicker and more connections. It's great. And it got a lot of criticism, even though a lot of research has been done because it was messy. And when I'm trying to do this push to look at animals or investigate them in their home habitat, in their natural habitat, but it's messy. I can't control for like the wild rats we're looking at. I don't have a certificate telling me what day they were born and what they've been eating every day. But like, as you suggest, life is messy. Life is very messy. So any human work, we can't control for every single little thing they've done. But that puts the burden. It means that what we find needs to be robust enough to maintain or withstand all those little differences. Because what we're doing though in the lab is just it's too perfect. They're genetic clones. Everything's the same. They've eaten the same thing, interacted the same, except this one little diet thing. And even if we find that, that's why it's been so hard. I mean, all the drugs that are 90%, supposedly, of the drugs that look like they can help in an animal, a rat, don't translate into humans as we get into that messiness. But I'm embracing the messiness. We need the messiness with our research to try to find something that actually works.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of an experience I had quite a while ago now, longer than I care to admit. I got into trail running a little bit, and it was interesting when I started kind of because I've always been one of those geek out on the research type of people. I started digging into the research, and I've asked people this question frequently: is what do you think? Which group of runners do you think is more prone to injury, trail runners or road runners? People who are running on a flat surface or people who are running on a dynamic, rough trail? And 90% of the time, people will say, "Oh, the people who are running on the trail because they could trip, they could do blah 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 blah." The actual the actual data says the people who are running on roads are more prone to injury. And the reason is the people who are running on trails are getting a dynamic workout. They're getting a
Mhm.
messy workout.
And
Whereas the
they're
people,
vigilant about their environment.
yeah, and they're probably more vigilant. There's like it's the whole package is being engaged instead of people who are running on a flat surface. they're just doing a
Yep.
repetitive motion, and so
Got
they're
it.
more likely to get a repetitive strain
Mhm.
injury. And so when you go to research things, the reason that the rat running on the wheel isn't the cure is because it's not just the rat running on the wheel, it's the rat running on the wheel and then running over and digging in the shavings and then
Mhm.
doing whatever else the rat does in all of this enriched environment. It's
Mhm.
not the one thing. But unfortunately,
Mhm.
the way economics works, the only people who are going to fund it are the people who are selling the wheel. And if the wheel doesn't have a have an effective thing, then they're not going to bother funding it.
Right. It gets so frustrating the older I get. And I hear what you, and I get frustrated too on some podcasts. Oh, look, I hear this, do this one thing for whatever. And there's not in my experience, there's not a one thing, except that there's not a one thing, to know that there's not a one thing, an only thing that you can do to help with this. So embracing the messiness. And so that's an interesting comparison. I thought you were just thinking about having an accident and that you weren't paying attention. That's why I was saying vigilance on the trail. But it is better for your brain to be doing something that requires you to think. My husband, who's doing everything around the house, I'm dragging him to ballroom dancing lessons because that's so, it's not natural for us. It's hard. It's working together. But I can just feel that it's so good for our brain. It's working all that movement real estate. And so, yes, doing something that you're not good at is critical. So when you're saying hobbies, if you're doing something you don't even have to think about it, maybe that calms you down, but you need to move on to add something to your repertoire that requires you to learn and to fail, to learn, to figure things out, because that's critical for your brain as well.
It's you're a neuroscientist, so maybe you remember, or maybe you know the study that I've looked for it again. I remember reading it in my undergrad, and I don't remember who wrote it. I don't remember where it was from or anything, but I remember distinctly reading. It was a neuro. Oh, was it a? I think it was like a post-mortem brain dissection study of a guy with Alzheimer's, and he was a physicist, and he was engaged in physics right up until a few weeks before he died. But anyway, they did the dissection study on his brain, and and when he died, they were like, "Holy cow! How did this guy know anything?"
Hmm.
His brain was just so absolutely destroyed by Alzheimer's. But
Hmm.
the report was that he was starting to forget his keys and he was starting to show some memory loss. But like the study was like, compared to normal brains, this is absolutely shot.
Hmm. I don't know that case study, but there's a famous study in the US Dr. Snowden did with nuns, and they have a lot of nuns kind of have a more similar lifestyle than just everybody out there, sort of, reproductive diet, religious and such. But they've collected a good bit of data, like even based on the essays, the complexity of the essays they wrote and their cognitive engagement. Had cases where and that they talked them into donating their brains, which was very interesting from this group being very religious. And they had cases like that. And they were doing cognitive tests till the end. Someone who didn't show any decline, but had those stereotypical plaques and tangles. And we don't know exactly what is causing or if that is the signature, cause, but they saw that riddled with what looked like an Alzheimer's. And then others that showed impairment but didn't have as much as well. So you couldn't just go by that. But there's some inclination that the ones that were more cognitively active were more protected. And I've just been fascinated by a case that hopefully we'll be writing about or engaging in. Rebecca Chop, who just wrote the book, I have it back here, Still Me, or recently in a couple of years. And she was a university professor, most recently was at University of Denver, so very cognitively engaged. Not a university professor, a university president of three, I think it was Swarthmore, Colgate, and University of Denver. And she was diagnosed 6 years ago, 7 years ago, while she was at her prime of being a president of a university. It was devastating. Both her grandmothers had Alzheimer's. She knew, she was told to get her stuff in order. She may not be able to dress herself in a couple of years. And so she stepped down, like, in a responsible way from her position. But then one neurologist kind of pulled her to the side and said, there is this stuff about lifestyle, as if you're like selling this undercover drug to somebody. It's not mainstream medicine, because the mainstream medicine for Alzheimer's is thousands of dollars for injections and some of it. And it's quite experimental. So she bought a house kind of in the natural setting, got a dog that would require her to walk, started painting, started sleeping more, started eating a brain healthy diet. And a few months ago, she posted that she had her neurologist appointment and she was told that her symptoms are no longer consistent with Alzheimer's. It's pretty powerful. Not that that
Yeah.
can happen in every case, but for her case, really bombarding all the lifestyle stuff we've been talking about, slowed, stopped, whatever these symptoms, and she's doing great. So it's not necessarily a death. Things are going to go the same way for every person, but also what we're talking about prevention that we call cognitive reserve. So what you've done in an engaging world up to the time where this may be happening in your brain is going to give you some buffer as well. So lifestyle is going to be influencing every stage of something, even like Alzheimer's or maybe diseases such as Parkinson's and such as well. Not necessarily curing it, but maybe slowing it down and having a buffer.
You keep saying something that triggers one of my other pet peeves about research. You keep saying not that this is applicable to everybody.
I know I'm careful.
It's 100% true, 100% true. But this is my pet peeve about research. Again, going back to that double-blind placebo-controlled study nonsense. Everything's under that bell curve, and if it's not effective for everybody under that bell curve, then it's not effective. But what about this person over here that it was the magical freaking cure for? And what about this person over here that it murdered? Those are the interesting people. Those are the interesting people, not the people under the bell curve. Because the reality of it is everybody under the bell curve, they're probably going to get better anyway.
That's
But
interesting, yeah, to figure
but
out. Go
but
ahead.
yeah, but it's those people that the real information lies in. But like based on my experience with the research environment, unfortunately way too often there's like, well, that person is 3 standard deviations from the mean, so we'll just cut that data
Oh, yeah, yeah.
because it just throws everything off, and it's obviously an outlier of some
Yeah.
sort and we don't know why, so we're just going to ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is individual differences, and you're right. That's going to tell us what may be causing or protecting more than the people who are all acting the same or more similar. And a lot of times in research, we want our samples to not be so different from one another. But I think more and more we're starting to recognize that understanding the individual differences, which we've just bred out of our rats. We want them to all be clones. That's why I really like going out to the wild and looking at all the extremes. But you're right, there's some really interesting data in this case that did this. And this may allow us to understand a mechanism that we can't really get at with other populations. So looking at families where something is just highly prevalent, like a disease or something, and okay, that's an interesting family to look at. Can we learn something that we couldn't see that was masked in these other individuals? So it takes all different types of strategies, approaches to try to figure out and get close to what some of these universal truths are about the brain. We've been
Yeah.
too limited, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in an attempt to trap you into a headline-worthy title, Dr. Lambert says that, do you think from the clinical perspective or the clinical application of your work then would be, don't just get out and do something repetitive, get out and do something challenging, because the effort driven reward cycle is driven by effort, not just, so if you're not putting effort in, if you're not increasing, if you're not learning, if you're not improving, then you're probably not getting the full benefit.
Right. Challenging and engaging. And your brain pays a lot of attention when something doesn't go right. We call it a prediction error. So it's like, whoops, what just happened. And so if it's an engaged brain that's learning, it's going to figure out what just happened, pay attention to it so that you can do it the next time. So if you're never failing or messing up, you pretty much are like a robotic. So you're just using your subcortical brain, maybe, the lower parts, the reptilian parts, and you're not engaging all these, this cortical area with all these connections. But movement, it doesn't seem very cerebral, and it's not cerebellar. But movement, engagement, the senses, our biggest organ is our skin, so touch. And what we are recently looking at that was in that TEDx talk is hope. And we started talking about that. But when you hope and anticipate something, your dopamine system and a lot of brain areas are activated as you're imagining it, as you're planning it. And I think that's a big part kind of related to this effort-based rewards, the anticipation. So we're looking at anticipation in our rats and stretching it out and we see more markers of neuroplasticity. We see, especially in the males, a shift to optimism, this cognitive strategy that we think something will work, and that expectation is a real brain event. So yeah, you got to get your notebook out to keep up with all the things you need to be doing, but engagement, challenging, hope, all of that. Rats are telling us. It's humbling when a rat reminds me that hope and positive emotions are worthwhile. And that's really what happened.
And yeah, and then get your notebook out to write down all the things that you have to do. But it really does boil down to just put some effort in to whatever you enjoy and learn something new.
That's good for your brain. Yeah, you got to take care of yourself, and hopefully that's a good something that you're doing. So there are some other parameters and maybe guardrails, but yeah, I mean, it's not, it's not brain
brain
surgery.
science.
It's not brain surgery. It's brain plasticity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
Do you have any like social media and stuff like that that people can come follow your research at?
Yeah, I'm on X. Yeah, sure. Now you'll just have to Kelly Lambert, you are, I think, and Facebook. I hope to launch a Substack page or whatever you call it this week, maybe with Mother's Day. I have something, and that will be brain sculpting with Kelly Lambert. So it's not launched yet, but I also have an Audible original, healthy sculpting healthy brains with everyday activities. If you want to, it's a 6-series thingy that was posted in January. So with the Institute, they're going to be increasing. So yeah, and then the books that we mentioned.
Awesome. I will link as many of those in the show notes as I can. And again, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge and your experience. And with that, we'll head on over to the after show.
All right. Thanks for having me, Andrew.